Hi, welcome to Mental Health Monday Live. We do this once a month on the third Monday of the month. And this year we're studying development all year long with our Always Growing series. Right now on Mental Health Monday, we have our special guest that we have each Mental Health Monday, Dr. Kim Marxhausen. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Heidi. I'm excited about behaviorism.
I know. Are you actually just excited about behaviorism? Or are you excited to talk about behaviorism? Because I feel like
to,
those are
to
two
talk
different
about it.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
To
right.
straighten
Yeah.
things out.
To
Yeah.
straighten it out. Yeah, that's Kim and I are both on a vigilant effort to help us re-understand our relationship with behavior and motivation and everything too. So, all right, we're glad that you all are here. Hi, Jerry. It's always awesome when we start to see people show up for Mental Health Monday, and as we begin this Mental Health Monday dissection, if you will, of the theory of the month, which is behaviorism, we are going to talk about that concept of purpose a little bit, which we've been talking about on the website this month, related to industry, that sense of purpose, as well as motivation in particular. And Kim, I think people are really interested in motivation because we're trying to motivate ourselves, we're trying to motivate our kids, we're trying to motivate the people in our midst, whether that's whatever vocation, right? Family vocations or out there in our communities. Motivation is pretty huge. So can you just give us like the two-minute intro to behavioral theories and what the point is? Why should we care about this?
Well, if we're going to look at behaviorism at its very basic level, is this idea that if you have a behavior and you punish it, you're going to make that behavior less likely. And if you reward it, you're going to make that behavior more likely. But I love how you started off talking about motivation, because the behaviors were not interested in any kind of motivation. They said anything that happens inside the head, we don't care about. We only look at what the behaviors that we can see. And that's where I think the whole theory falls flat.
No,
Because
that's
it
really
doesn't
good.
take into
Exactly.
account
No, I love
it
that.
doesn't take into account our persistence or
Mhm.
our interests or how we respond to failure. It just
Ooh.
assumes failure means it's going to stop. Success means it's going to go.
Right. Like there's this assumption in behavioral theories that's number one, if I like give myself the right rewards or enough rewards or the reward connected well enough to this thing, then I will succeed. Or if I remove the rewards, that would also be another method, right? Or if I punish myself is like the far end of that. And I really appreciate how I think you and I have multiple issues with behavior theory, although we're going to move into that in a minute. I love how you point out that so our listeners know at the core of behavior theory, they're not talking about motivation. And that's maybe one of our number one complaints is that we are complicated creatures. Everybody raise your hand in the comments if you're listening and you're a complicated creature, right? And you would like to be seen as a complicated creature. And I notice this even in little kids, right? So we use a little bit of behavior theory. I mean, in probably every therapeutic intervention with children, but at the same time, I am not going to change the shape of that child's mental health by behavior theory, right? By rewards and punishments. And as parents, like we're like in teachers, school systems, all like archived in our head is like we must offer rewards and punishments. So Kim, let's talk about motivation. Help us get to those deeper levels of like connecting the behaviors to the other realms of thoughts, feelings, and relationship and stuff and our spirituality. And so our first question is, do you think we have an inherent desire to understand or control our behavior? Like, what's the connection with our desire and our behavior, if you will?
Oh, yes, we have an inherent desire to control behavior. And it's one of those things that is both a blessing from God and we've turned it into a curse. So the blessing from God is that we are really built to develop over the course of a lifetime self-regulation skills. And that's controlling our attention and our emotions and our behavior so that all of those things work for us instead of against us. The problem becomes when we try to control the world around us, or control other people, or control our path to heaven.
Yeah, that's not going to
Because
go well, right?
Yeah, it's not. That's going to be a failure. And I think maybe a good example, because you're talking about motivations, and also talking a little bit about the need to feel motivated right now, because we're all so weary when we talk
Oh,
about
that's a good
COVID.
point. Mm-hmm.
We're really tired of it. But I speak a lot to teachers and parents about dealing with anxiety in children. And the thing is if we treat those anxiety behaviors with punishment and reward, we're not going to be successful, because that desire, that motivation to get rid of that anxiety is much stronger than any punishment or reward that we can come up with.
Ooh, I have to say a quick word to that, just because my specialization is anxiety, and I
Yes.
feel really strongly about that. And I would say that punishment and reward related to anxiety in particular, and I think people are probably picturing things in their head as you talk about that, is also in how we communicate then too. So not just in what we give and take away and things like that, but also even as adults, our motivation to stop being afraid is never going to come from being told, which I really believe at this point people receive like being told to not be afraid or stop being anxious as a punishment, almost like that is it incites shame and things like that internally. And so just being aware of how we talk and responding to that anxiety with connection is definitely biblical. And so Christ always leans in, right? But I love what you're saying of like considering the motivation, like what's the core of this? Where is our heart? What do we need? Like anxiety is our body's reminder, like, hey, I need a little attention on something, And so I love that. I love that you brought that to bear, because I definitely think we see that hugely in our world today. So that is really helpful. And control, I think it is a natural human inclination, but like you noted, where are we trying to rob God of the goodness he's trying to give us? That's really helpful. Oh, sorry, my dogs are making themselves known. So speaking of God, you went into this a little bit. How does God deal with behavior? Like, what is God's vantage point, I guess? Is he concerned with punishment and reward? Is he concerned with motivation? How does this work spiritually?
Well, I always imagine that God looks at behaviorism and just kind of shakes his head. He's not a very good behaviorist, because he's remarkably inconsistent with punishment and reward. I mean, our life would be really simple if God always punished people who didn't believe and rewarded those of us who are faithful in our belief. But it doesn't happen that way, does it? Mm-hmm. And yet God still reaches out to us and meets our need and loves us. But instead of staying with just law, because both punishment and reward are law, he also brings in gospel. Ooh, and that's what makes the big difference, isn't it?
Yeah, and having both things as part of the motivation. And I do think, is both you and I are, sorry, thank you. My husband just came home and the dogs are like, no. But having that law gospel perspective, and I think it is present in many denominations, but as Lutherans, we have like a very strong sense of this, I think, and the communication of that, being aware that because of Jesus in our lives, the gospel is what is going to motivate, right? And people are always concerned, well, I mean, but we also still need the law, which is true. Like we do need both of those things in our life, and they both have a place, accountability as well as grace and flexibility. And I know you're going to tell us a little bit more about this with kids in particular, but then also boundaries alongside vulnerability. Those both motivate us. Like we need some boundaries in our life, right? And the freedom, I think, to create boundaries. But we also need that vulnerability, which is, I think, so often pure grace in people's lives, because the world isn't a place that embraces that. So I appreciate that.
It's so easy for us to think of law as being just about punishment, when in reality, it's more often a guide for us. And so, God sent his son to save us instead of punishing us, which I'm particularly thankful for. And he also sent his spirit to sanctify us rather than train us.
Right.
And so there's another good area where God is not a behaviorist at all. I mean, he has completely different ideas of how to to reach out to us how to make that difference in our lives and our faith.
Yeah, and I think God's patience also shows how he's not a behaviorist. Like he doesn't have these set timelines. Well, if you don't come to me by this time, then I'm going to steal that reward back or whatever.
Right.
His patience is a really good representation that he's in it for the long haul. There's so much grace and flexibility while still having boundaries for even salvation. Like there is a time where his patience will end and things like that. So I think that's helpful, and teaching both those to kids. So I'm really excited about this section you're going to talk to us about, because I think for both people who have children, but also, like you said, I think we're all weary. And at our current time in our culture, I think we see the weight of the world on children right now around us in our communities and our teachers trying to teach those children. I just think we can all benefit from how do we better work with children and their motivations. And this is like your specialty, so I'm very excited that we have you to answer this question. But if we want to change, for instance, one of our own behaviors or a child's behavior in our lives, whether our own children or in the classroom, what is the best model? What do you think, Kim?
Well, we'll start with a little bit of vocabulary here. Proximal and distal goals, which I'm sure are familiar to you as a therapist. Those distal goals that's the one big goal you're headed for. And the proximal goals, of course, are the steps that get you there.
How do you, you know what? Can you spell distal for us just so everyone has that if they want to look up more?
Spelling's not my best gift, but Distal.
A-L. And distal, and you said proximal, which is like the proximity. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So they're, once you know what they mean, they're pretty easy to understand. But I usually share with teachers and parents, too, that if you want to use punishment and reward, you can use that with the proximal goals, but you don't want to use it with the distal goals. So as an example, in the classroom, you don't want to reward children or punish them when they read, because it is your distal goal for them to be readers and to enjoy reading and turn to reading. So instead, you want to keep those punishments and rewards to those short steps that are along the way, the kinds of steps that you get past.
Okay, that makes sense. I don't, it's funny, and maybe it's just because I'm that far removed from behavior theory at this point, but like I don't consider those things. In therapy we write treatment plans and things like that, but therapy I feel like has come so far with this. I mean, there's still a lot of people who use a lot of behavior theory, but in my therapeutic setting, in my therapy room, we're gonna really go with like the stuff of the moment, like really be engaged in the now, as well as kind of linking past, present, and future, which maybe that's just an EMDR kind of adaptive information thing. But I appreciate that, like the idea that when we want maybe something to remain good for a child and pleasant, especially, like reward and punishment is for the very close-up thing, like this moment, like, hey, here's a sticker, or hey, here's, if you can do this for 3 days, then yeah, we'll go get ice cream or something. But for the longer term, like we don't want to have so much based on rewards and punishment. Yeah.
Well, here's an example, because if you do too much of the punishment and reward, you're going to get rid of the motivation. That's one thing that we understand. So if you want a natural motivation, you want to nurture it. So let's say I want to lose some weight. Okay, that's my distal goal. If I go and put on Facebook or Instagram, and say, hey, everybody, I've got this goal to lose weight, and I get lots of responses, you know what? My brain's going to tick that off, because I've gotten rewards. And so now that goal of losing weight is going to be smaller. But if I set those small goals, like I'm going to exercise 5 times this week and reward myself for that, then I can keep turning around and building it. And it works the same way with our kids too. If you want children who value telling the truth, then you need to look at, well, what is the natural reward that are the small steps? Well, the first thing I have to do is help that child to understand that they are safe and loved if they tell me they've done something wrong. So you see that difference
That's
between
good. No, I love
far
it.
and the close.
And the distal goal sounds really related to values, like you just said. So if I want my child to learn honesty, if I want them to learn respect, if I want them to learn grace, I really have to consider the kind of like long-term implications of the way we're communicating, what our environment looks like, and things like that. So I wonder from the listener, what kinds of proximal goals have you set? Like what kind of small goals, like what kind of like within the day or within the week kind of goals do you set for yourself? I think as a scholastic person, I am all about some proximal goals for myself in each day.
Yes.
Like, I'm going to finish this reading assignment, or I'm going to do this thing. I remember even in like grade school, if I read 20 more pages, then I'm going to give myself an apple. Or that internal motivation. Now, we're not all internal motivators, right? So what do we do? How do we, if we're not internally motivated, how do we set those proximal goals differently? Do you have any insight on that?
Well, anytime you're going to do any kind of training, whether you're training yourself or you're training a child, you have to have that balance between the expectations you have of yourself and your own responsiveness. Mm-hmm. And so being really clear about those expectations and writing them down and making them very specific, like you were just talking about. Not, I'm going to finish this paper, but I'm going to finish writing this point in this paper, and then, I can go for a little walk and then come back. But those really short things, those are the expectations, but the responsiveness can take so many forms. It can be about mercy, forgiving yourself if you don't meet a goal. It can be about realizing what you need to do to make that goal more likely to happen. And it can be about just stopping and thinking and praying about that, being responsive to it, and like you like to say, being in the here and now.
Yeah.
With it.
Yeah, having moments with it instead of just like, gotta get the thing, which, we've been talking about industry over at HeidiGaiman.com in particular this month, and that idea that industry can turn into productivity in our culture, and that's really not the only piece of industry. Like, we want to create something, we want to contribute something, but when we're talking about industry, we're really talking about that sense of purpose in what we do. And I think that connects to that concept, sorry, my dogs are out of control today, of distal goal, is that we all are concerned about values at the core, and we don't want to lose that kind of forest for the tree. And so if I, for instance, berate myself for not exercising without stepping back to be like, or let me be more specific. If I berate myself for not running a marathon, let's say, right?
Yes.
And then without stepping back to be like, is that something I really value? No, I value exercise. I value doing something for my health each day physically. And so I really think that's helpful to look at the distal goal when we want to be motivated for change, when we know we need to do something, and we want a behavior from ourselves or from our kids, asking, what's the value? What's the long-term goal here? And then moving toward that proximal goal of like, okay, what would that really look like today, as step one and things like that. So
I like what you're saying about, instead of punishing yourself, take a look and learn something. So you had a small failure. Hey, that defines my life. Don't know about you, but let's look at that. And what can I learn? So if I went for a week without getting a walk in every day, well, let's see, it was raining. Now I need to come up with a backup plan, don't I? So instead of berating myself and saying I didn't walk this week, I come up with another plan. I'm going to go to the mall and walk if it's raining, or I'm going to buy a really cool umbrella. I don't know, but you're learning from your failures that way.
Yeah,
and that
you get
really
to know
improves
yourself.
Your motivation.
Yeah, and I think honestly that feeds all those big distal goals, is like getting to know yourself a little bit more in it too, which is really, and God is usually almost always big picture. He's very concerned about the long-term plan, much more concerned about than the moment behavior. Now, I'm not saying like just go and be sinful and do whatever. Obviously we're not saying that, but at the same time, like, we are more concerned about the value in the long term than did you get up and do your things. And I think if we can help as Christians, especially those of us who follow Jesus, understanding that part of his character a little bit better, I think helps us translate it better to other people. And I think of all my friends who do like Beachbody and Plexus and oils and all these different health related things. I think dialing into our relationship with God will help us communicate those things that we value better, instead of what maybe a company decides about those things that we're communicating that can sound so reward and punishment focused and very behavioral. That was a small tangent on my part, but I appreciate that. And so you have some stuff, and I want you to repeat this very clearly just because it was such a valuable piece for me when I was reading through the notes, is children need both expectations as well as responsiveness. So you're so good at examples, Kim. I don't know if you have an example or if you want to describe that a little bit more for us. I think we all need, even in our spousal relationships, our friendships, our church relationships, our vocations, expectations as well as responsiveness. But especially for children, how do we go about, holding those things together?
Well, they are very important and they have to be balanced. You don't want to think about what your child will grow up to be like if there's no expectations. They'll be lost. And at the same time, if everything that you do with your children is about expectations and not about meeting their needs, then they'll be afraid. They're not going to want to take risks because there's no safety net for what they do. So I think maybe a good example is, if you're working with a young child so that you can take them shopping, because moms, we've all been there.
I took my groceries. We're going to hunt them. Thankfully, grocery pickup exists now.
Yeah. We have those errands we want to do. So you set these expectations about, we're at the grocery store, you're not going to ask for anything, or we're not going to do the whining, or, whatever those expectations are. But then the responsiveness comes in when the child doesn't meet the expectation. Now you have to take a look at it and say, well, what happened there? The parent looks at it and say, we were shopping at a bad time of the day, or we were shopping too long and my child got a little bit too tired. So I need to step in with mercy at this point and say, okay, we're going to end this shopping thing right now, or do whatever we need to do. And so it's balancing and going back and forth between those two things. What do I need to do? How can I reach out? What do I realize is happening? And in that process, we're teaching our children empathy. We're teaching them how to evaluate their failures. We're teaching them how to care about each other. And once we've connected a learning with empathy, now we've got some deep learning.
Oh, I love that. And it's interesting to me as I hear you talking about that, it also sounds like the expectations are kind of like the longer term, even though they sound like short term, like you're going to stand next to me in the grocery store. We're not going to climb into the car. Like these different things. They sound very short term, but like thinking of that longer term, we're setting them up to be citizens in this world and be thriving individuals. I think that's a huge piece of expectation, is what do we want this to turn out like when they're 22, maybe not. And same thing for our own selves, right? Like, what do I want to look like in 10 years versus like this moment. However, then the other side of expectation, that responsiveness for ourselves and other people, sounds a lot more about that moment. Like in the moment, what needs to happen, and kind of going with the flow a little bit more too, for ourselves, but also the children in our lives. Yeah.
Well, if we respond always with the punishment and reward, we'll train them in the moment, but not in the long term. So what is your child going to do when they're 22 and their decision about being honest is not so easy?
Right.
So when we connect the short term with the long term by saying, here is why, We have consideration for the people around us, or here's why we're truthful. Then we're setting them up to be able to use God's word to make their own choices.
Yeah, that's why I think we've seen too, like in classrooms, like the little charts that are like red, yellow, green, or whatever, which behavior, language things in the classroom, right, get changes in that. But I've noticed a huge change to this more like a Roy G. Biv like color scheme of those things, right? So there's a lot more responsiveness is what they're building in to the expectations. And then that is different, like moving up and down this whole thing and just kind of monitoring our day and where we're at and how we are at when we come to the conclusion is a lot different than you had a good day, here's a piece of candy, or you get electronics. I mean, I do a fair amount of, when you talk about behavior theory, what is it called when you remove something from your teenager?
Well, you're extinguishing a behavior then.
Okay, yes. But I remove electronics from them a lot based on, right? Like that's a kind of reward punishment, right? Is when you take the thing away. And so I think we do those things, but I understand that those things aren't going to be the thing that builds them into this person who does their schoolwork with joy or like has life goals, right? But that will help me in this week be able to get chores done or to be able to, understand that there are some consequences, but it's not going to turn them into this person that I'm looking for. So yeah, I appreciate
treating them like a puppy dog.
Yes.
Because puppy dogs don't understand the why behind it. And as parents, we can, as children grow and their brains expand, we can help them to understand, okay, you don't like it when I take away the electronics, but here's our goal, that homework gets done first, that you set that priority.
Yeah, that's really good, Kim. I appreciate that. And the idea that we move into coaching. So maybe in the moment too, again, we might need to use a little bit more reward punishment or things related to that. Like I need this behavior to change in this moment because we're going to get hit by a car in a parking lot if we don't hold our hand, right? But then like the wraparound is more related to that coaching of like, how did that go? What did that look like? And that is, 75% of the thing happening, not the like 25% that is this like behaviorist kind of thing.
And your example is really good for seeing the difference between rewarding proximal and distal too, because if you're going to reward distal goal and getting your homework done before you do electronics, then you're going to say, okay, I'll give you $5 for every A. I don't recommend that. But keep the rewarding punishment to the proximal goals, because you don't want them to just do schoolwork to get rewards. You want them to see that a good report card is in itself a reward.
And we know from research this is proven like vocationally in like workplaces too. So like lots of people think that people are rewarded by like the $500 bonus or by this thing or that thing, when in reality we know they are like much more likely to do a bit higher quality job, to be more inventive and innovative if we give them creative spaces to work in relationship with other people. These are very like less tangible things, which is funny. Like it's not the passing on of the reward, it's like the culture and that environment of responsiveness that you talked about even within our workplace culture. So yes, awesome. So our last question before we wrap up is how do we see our purpose and industry as well as our goodness, I guess, because especially as Christians we're very concerned about like the goodness factor and raising good children and having good people around us. How do we move in that outside of what we produce, outside of being like, look, my kids succeeded and we're all great and they are successful in their career and they didn't go to jail. And for ourselves, like, I have my COVID-19 pounds. So what do I do with that? How do I see myself out of what I'm producing?
Well, it comes back so often to how do we deal with our failures? Because if our failures just mount up, we start to feel that shame. But when we can deal with that failure and learn from it, and we know that we are loved, and we know that God has a purpose for us, then we've got the motivation to move on from those failures. And I really like to think of this in terms of having a faith self-understanding. So when we understand ourselves, that can be about our self-concept, how do we label ourselves? It can be about our self-esteem. Do we feel good about ourselves? It can be about our self-efficacy. Do we think we can get things done? But if we only look at ourselves, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. Because what if one of those things falls apart? Now we've got trauma, don't we? Now we have trauma. So if we can help ourselves to understand, if we can pray about this, if we can train our children to understand this, that in terms of our self-concept, we're first and foremost a child of the Heavenly Father. Those other labels can change, but that's always true. And our self-esteem, how good are we? It doesn't matter because we're forgiven. We don't have to focus on that about being good. We're forgiven,
right? Yeah, goodness.
And how effective are we? Well, we're sanctified by the Spirit. We've been set apart to do God's good work, and whether or not it happens is up to the Spirit. And I love that so much for me personally, to not have to look at myself, but instead to look at my relationship with God.
Yeah, and I mean, I really believe that we can talk about all the mental health things till the cows come home, and we love it. Like, that is our like area. However, without addressing those spiritual components and where we are with God, our motivation will always be just all over the place and not in a healthy space, which hugely impacts our mental health. I think even secularly have started to understand spiritual connectedness. Whatever that means for a person. But for us, we know it's with God and Christ. Being connected in some way is going to be one of the things that I can do for my mental health, for my motivation, for seeing the changes I want to come in my life and the life of my family more than anything. So.
And I would say it's the first thing we need to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's one of those things, like, you can't oversimplify. Like, don't attend to your mental health and only worry about, what Scripture says. But at the same time, if we have lost, I think, that core thing of what God says in His Word and things like that, then we're not going to see the growth we want in these other areas. Absolutely.
Matthew 6 tells us, seek first His kingdom.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Yes. And all these things will be added, right? And I like how you pointed out, like, the moving from kind of creation, redemption to sanctification. God invites us into it. Like, we don't, you can't let one drop off. I think it's very easy to be like, oh, child of the Heavenly Father, that's my version of, like, being spiritually connected, and that's all I got. But instead moving into all of those realms in freedom in Christ. And that makes the greatest impact then for our mental, relational, even physical health, So yeah, good stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. I think it's the best Christian worldview that we can give our children.
That's good.
To start with that. Yeah.
Very holistic, like, core. And then everything else comes out of that. Yeah, very good. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for joining us for Mental Health Monday today on behavior theories and purpose and motivation. Next month, we'll be talking culture. I think it'll be really interesting. Different cultural theories, how cultures are kind of built, and but especially around the idea of identity, right? So we all have cultures that we live in and cultures that overlap that we live in. We're going to really define, I think, what we're talking about as far as culture goes, because I think we have a very limited, narrow view of culture based on, like, ethnicity or something, or a country, a national origin or something like that. Yeah. Instead, we're going to broaden that a little bit, and how does that impact our identity as well? So, all right. Well, thanks for joining us. We'll see you all next time.
Bye-bye.